Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here today. My name is Kecia. I'm with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, and I'm here with Illana Melzer of 71.4, and we're very excited to present to you the lessons learned in the last 2 years with the Transaction Support Center. We're delighted to also have with us colleagues from Cities Alliance. Cities Alliance sponsored the work and supported the preparation of this report, as well as Tough 21, which has provided us with support over the last year for the operations of the Transaction Support Center in Khayelitsha, the City Support Program from National Treasury and GTEC, as well as the MasterCard Foundation and Oppenheimer Generations. You come from all over the world, actually. We have colleagues with us today from almost every continent and from so many diverse organizations. And I think one of the reasons why we have such a wide array of people from across the globe is that this is an issue that really is significant and of interest in very, very many contexts. And although this is a story about a case within Khayelitsha, it has resonance in so many other contexts where people are thinking about tenure security and access to housing. So our agenda for today is we'll start with an overview. I'll give an overview of the South African housing market and how the Transaction Support Center and Khayelitsha itself fits into that. And then Illana will take over and she'll give the body of the presentation, looking at what the Transaction Support Center is, and then our experience in solving cases, and then looking forward into where we're going next. Okay, the problem statement and why we did this. Let's first take a look at just an overview of residential property markets in South Africa. So many of you would have seen the work that we've been doing over the years, trying to understand the structure, composition of South Africa's property market and how it performs. And what we do is we take deeds registry data that we source from Lightstone and we segment it by value. And if you do that and you look at the 6.6 million residential properties that are on the deeds registry in South Africa, just over half of those are valued at less than 600,000 Rand, and that's at the end of December 2019. So that's the entry-level market, which we've colored in green in the pie, and the affordable market, which we've colored in blue. I also refer to the affordable market as the working class market. Then we also have three other segments: the conventional market, which is properties worth between 600,000 Rand and 900,000 Rand, the high-end market, which is properties worth 900,000 Rand and 1.2 million. Some people might think those are still affordable in Cape Town. And then the luxury market, which is properties worth over 1.2 million. And I think when you look at the nation as a whole, just over half are valued at less than 600,000 Rand. About a third, just under a third of all properties have been financed by the state in the past 26 years. Comprising the government subsidized housing program. And at the moment, we can find about 2 million government subsidized properties on the deeds registry. Now we know that the government has built more than that, and they report that every year in their estimates of national expenditure and in their annual reports. But not all of those get registered on the deeds registry, and using a proxy, we can find about 2 million of those. If we were to imagine that the full complement of properties that have been built were indeed registered on the deeds registry, it would be about 43% of the total market. Next slide. So RDP houses are everywhere, and you know what they look like when you drive past them, you see them. But for our international guests, this is what they look like. Government subsidized properties have been built since 1994. They're made available to households earning less than 3,500 Rand who have never owned a property before and who have dependents. They have different values. Just under 3/4 of them are worth less than 300,000 Rand each, and just under another quarter are worth between 300,000 and 600,000 Rand. About 75,000 of of government subsidized properties on the deeds registry are worth between 600 and 900,000 Rand. Last year, just under 21,500 were added to the deeds registry. And say for 2018, when almost 30,000 were added, the annual growth in government subsidized properties in the last 10 years or so has been about 20,000 new units per annum. Again, we're building more than that, but the number that are appearing on the deeds registry is limited to about 20,000. Last year, so 2019, about a total of 12,600 were formally resold. So they sold on the resale market legally. And of those, about a quarter of them were financed with a bond. That's about 3,333 bonds, mortgages that were extended to government subsidized houses. And that was worth about 1.6 billion Rand of private capital. And just think about that, that the state has put this money literally into the ground, and that's now stimulated additional investment by the households themselves. You can see with these ones, there's lots of additions and changes made to them, and then also mortgage lending in that space. The total value of all government subsidized housing currently on the deeds registry is about 467 billion Rand. Next slide. I think it's important to emphasize, we often imagine that government subsidized houses would be in that green category, in the under 300,000 Rand category, because that's about what they cost to build them originally. But what we can see is that there is a diversity, that some are in the affordable market and some are also in that next, in the conventional market. Critically, we have the preemptive clause is a restriction on the title deed that says that they cannot be sold for the first 8 years. But the vast majority are in fact older than that 8 years resale restriction. Next slide. If you look at the value, the average value of properties, of government subsidized properties by their age, what we've got here is a graph that shows each of the major metros in South Africa. And then the blue bar is the value of the property in that city of government subsidized properties that are younger than 8 years old. And the orange is older than 8 years. And I've highlighted Cape Town because that's where our focus will be today. South Africa's cheapest newly built house at the moment is about 380,000 Rand. So what the government has done through the delivery of this stock is created units that are in fact a new first rung on the property ladder. Next slide. An important part of creating value within housing is the role of mortgage lending. And here what we've done is we've looked at government subsidized properties that were sold annually between 2018 and 2008 to 2019. And those with a mortgage on the left, and the value is the height of the bar, and without a mortgage on the right. Now you can see the number just above the bar is the number of properties that were sold in that year with or without a mortgage, and then the height of the bar is the value itself. And this is one of the things we'll be looking at. Why are so few government subsidized properties sold without a mortgage, when those sold with a mortgage achieve a much better price for the seller? And one of the reasons has to do with sales. This is an ad I took from an online sales site yesterday that specify cash buyers only. But there are other reasons as well, and we'll talk about that. Next slide. One of the things that I'm most excited about is the role of first-time home buyers. And we can see that the RDP resale market is significant. So here what I've looked at is South Africa, Cape Town, and then Khayelitsha, which is the neighborhood we're looking at. And these graphs show first-time home buyers as a percentage of all resale or secondary transactions by market segment. And it's possible that it's not just a resale transaction between individuals, but it could also be a secondary transaction as a result of a deceased estate. And we can't tell the difference right now. But the dark blue bars are the total number of transactions in 2019, and the light blue bars are the percentage of those that were for first-time home buyers. And this basically means that households who would have not been able to afford a house, the cheapest newly built house, which is about, as I said, 380,000 Rand, have been able to purchase one as a first-time home buyer through the government RDP resale market. And critically take a look at Khayelitsha. When we see the predominance of first-time home buyers in resale transactions in Khayelitsha, that shows that you have people who would have been what we've been calling the gap market, acquiring property through the resale of government subsidized housing. Next slide. This is the same picture, but what it shows is bonded resale transactions. So of the transactions in the previous slide, which of those were financed with a mortgage bond? And this shows us that mortgage lenders are actually financing the resale transactions of government subsidized housing. But in the bottom entry segment, that was only 11% of all resale transactions nationally. So what are the barriers? And that's something that Illana will be talking about. Next slide. So just to summarize, we have a deeds registry of 6.6 million residential properties. And of those, about 2 million were subsidized by the state. The national churn rate right now is about 2.5%. If we then look at just the government subsidized properties, half of them are outside the metros and half of them are inside the major metros, where you would expect much more churn, much more resale. But the resale rate, the churn rate for the full national complement of government subsidized housing is just under, was under 1%, 0.61%. However, of those 1 million or so government subsidized properties in the major metros, the majority, 905,000, are older than 8 years. So that means they've passed the preemptive clause and can actually be legally traded. So if we were to apply the national churn rate of 2.5% to that number, that would be 22,544 transactions per annum. Now think about what that means. That's 22,544 new transactions of properties that are cheaper than the cheapest newly built house that we've got on the market. Those could be financed by a mortgage, and that could be 22,544 new mortgages. And those transactions create sellers who then become new buyers of another, creating demand for another 22,544 transactions. So this is a huge asset. And the opportunity for this to actually address our current, we have such challenges right now, challenges of national economic growth, of job creation, and of the sustainability of our cities. This market is the key to really turning things around. But there are serious constraints, and that's what we've been experiencing and addressing in the last 2 years. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Illana. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Kecia. What I'm going to do is just start looking at, in general, what the Transaction Support Centre is, and then focus on 3 categories of cases. The report that we've published has a few more categories, and for those readers who are interested, you can see all the detail there on transactions supported by FLISP, capital subsidies, as well as a couple of other categories of cases. But for the purposes of just giving a sense of the work that we're doing and then laying the ground, the foundations for the way forward for the TSC, we'll just focus on those 3: informal cash sales, deceased estate transfers, and primary transfers. Okay, so to begin with, what is the Transaction Support Centre? It's a pilot action research initiative that was started by 71.4 and CAHF. It's located in Khayelitsha, in an area of Khayelitsha called Makaza. And it provides free assistance and advice for people who need to formalise ownership or who are looking to buy and sell residential properties. And when we started the Transaction Support Centre, we called it Transaction Support because we thought we were going to be offering transaction. In fact, when we have a look at our cases, what you'll see is that we do actually very few transactions and much more work in terms of helping people formalise tenure. So by all rights, we probably should have called the TSC the Tenure Support Centre. You'll also see that we provide free assistance. That is free. We do ask our clients to pay for disbursements that conveyancers will have to fund. If clients are indigent, we provide an absolutely free service. They will get a full property transfer without having to pay anything. The way the Transaction Support Centre works is that at the base of the work, obviously, is the work that we do with individual clients. That's the day-to-day operations of onboarding clients, helping them to resolve the issues that they're facing. And we work with a range of service providers to do that. So we work with City in a lot of detail. We work with mortgage lenders, conveyancers, electrical contractors who need to give us certificates, a range of service providers there. And then take those experiences, document them in case studies, and where we need to elevate some policy or regulatory issues into the policy space, as well as into the space with executives in those sectors in the private sector. But as I say, the base of the work is really with individual clients, and that gives us the insight and the understanding of what people actually have to, the hurdles people actually have to overcome to transact and transfer property or secure tenure at the moment. And that's very powerful evidence. And we find that those case studies, those individual stories that we tell about the lives of clients and how they're impacted, sometimes have more of an effect than all the big numbers that we can put together and all the financial models that we can build. Just in terms of the way the team works, just on the ground team, so I'm going to start with Lisa, who provides the legal support. So she's a conveyancer, and she actually engages with all the conveyancers that we work with. She prepares all the matters and prepares drafts of the documents. She's supported by Masi, who works in the office and deals with clients on an individual basis. And then just to enable us to interact productively in the community, Meolisi is our community engagement officer. He helps engage with street committees, with local leadership, arranges community meetings, and then Jess on our team puts together case studies, the presentations and reports, including this one, and she monitors market activity as well. In terms of our supporters and stakeholders more broadly, Kecia has mentioned the funders that we work with. So Tough 21, who's funded us for the past year, the MasterCard Foundation, who's funded our blockchain pilot, the CSP through GTAC and Treasury providing initial support when we started the operations, and the Cities Alliance, who's provided funding to do this work, write it up and present it, and then Oppenheimer Generations moving forward, who's committed to supporting the work of the TSC. But as I mentioned, we work extensively with private sector providers, and in particular, just want to mention the conveyancers that we work with, who provide their services, professional services, free of charge. So Norton Rose Fulbright, Abrams and Goss, and STBBE. Those are the conveyancers we work with, and as I mentioned, they don't charge professional service, they don't charge professional fees, but we will ask our clients where they're able to contribute to disbursements that are required. A couple of other providers, just a mention to FNB, who's worked very closely with us to try and see what it takes to actually put together a mortgage on some fairly unusual transactions. We also partner extensively with a range of other NGOs and interested parties. So just to mention specifically of Khayelitsha, which is part of the Free Markets Foundation initiative with regard to property transfers, and then other partners, in particular the World Bank groups and their Ilemba project. So just a special mention to colleagues at Geo Africa, so that would be Chris, and then World Bank consultants, Gavin and Amina, who've been very, very supportive in our work, and just also completely on the same mission of trying to understand and identify challenges that impact on property registration, and then think up solutions for that. In terms of solutions, I just want to mention CESO Global, who's our partner on the blockchain project, and we think there's a lot of potential to move forward with that particular pilot. Government, we work extensively with officials in the City of Cape Town and with officials at the Western Cape Department of Human Settlements. I've mentioned National Treasury, who are a partner in terms of funding. But government partners that we work with on an operational level, the city and the province, we don't actually have any formal memorandums of understanding with those entities. So we work on the basis of personal relationships. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. We're located in Makaza in Khayelitsha, which has been in the news recently. Some of you might be aware, for all the wrong reasons. It is a very interesting area, about 30 kilometers outside of the CBD of Cape Town. So it depends on your perspective whether that's far or not. About 47,000 registered properties, and 2/3 of those would be valued at under 300,000 Rand. The average churn rate just over 1.1%, and you can see for the city of Cape Town, the average is 3.5%. We see some activity. 128 residential properties were formally transferred through the deeds office. We're not sure how many of those would be deceased estate transfers, so we think quite a lot of them would be. So those resale transactions, many of them might be deceased estate transfers, but you can see 486 new transfers, so that's primary registrations, and of those, 467 were new RDP houses, so new government sponsored houses. You can see 95 of the 364 properties that transacted, which were originally RDP houses, 95 were bonded. And I just want to mention that our work in Makaza focuses on formally demarcated properties. You can see immediately below Makaza is an area called Enkanini. Enkanini is a very, very large informal settlement comprising around 10,000 households, we think, 10,000 structures. Makaza, in contrast, we can count probably around 4,500 to 5,000 properties. So Enkanini is absolutely enormous. We don't do work in Enkanini. So our work focuses on formally demarcated properties and then helping to secure registration and tenure for those properties. I think in future iterations of the work of the TSC, we would love an opportunity to expand into informal areas and see what kind of solutions we can pilot. Important to just take a step back and think about why we want to formalize property markets. Obviously, for the citizen, there are enormous advantages in terms of secure tenure. Living in a situation where you don't know that you own your house and your neighbors don't know that you own your house, you can just imagine the kind of anxiety that causes for property owners, and we see that a lot with our clients. From a wealth perspective, obviously, it's a leverageable asset, and it's the biggest component of household wealth. When we look at the household balance sheet in South Africa, residential property is a very significant component of that. Obviously, with assets as opposed to income, if we're looking at the difference between, let's say, an income distribution and an asset distribution, well, the asset value reflects not only what the house currently is worth, but how well the market currently operates. And as Kecia mentioned in her introductory comments, the market is not working optimally, and so that household wealth can be significantly understated. And part of our work is to bring that wealth up to the level that it should be. With regard to the city, obviously, where you have formalization, you can actually engage with the citizen, you can deliver services, you can charge for those services, so there's a real link to revenue, and obviously you can engage with that property owner with regards to how that property is developed over time, and so speaks directly to the issue of governance. And so in our work, in terms of the formalization of property markets, what we're really after are two primary objectives, and that would be administrative visibility. So that's enabling the city to understand who the property owner is and to be able to engage with that property owner using formal city processes. And the other really interesting component there is bankability. And that's providing the financial sector with a mechanism to participate in wealth creation in local areas. And we've put in the middle the title deed, and of course the title deed as we understand it and as it's currently structured in South Africa is the ultimate objective of where we're working towards, but it might not necessarily be possible for all households to get there. And so we need to think about what other mechanisms might create administrative visibility and bankability, and we'll talk to that through the presentation. I think it's also important to just contextualize this within the COVID-19 context that we're currently experiencing, and think about what this does for household resilience and for the reconstruction of economies after post-COVID-19. We've been up and running for 2 years, as Kecia mentioned, and in that time we've signed up almost 400 clients. We've relied principally on word of mouth and community engagement, so very little above the line marketing. You can see our acquisition channels, 30% of our clients have come to us from street committees, and we think that's been a very productive channel. I mentioned earlier that Violisi spends a lot of his time talking to street committees and getting referrals directly from them on transactions that they have recently endorsed to just kind of formalize those transactions, so we get hold of buyers and sellers and try and do that work. Word of mouth, about a quarter of our clients come to us directly from referral, which is, again, a testament to the work that we do. Local radio, we've been on the radio station a couple of times, and that's very productive. And then as per the strapline community meetings. We do have a couple of posters. So if you go into the library, which is right next to our office, you'll see a poster. If you go into the shopping centre nearby, you'll see them. Very simple messaging, just to get across simple messages, and then to say to people, come and see us, that we can assist with property transfers. In terms of the way the caseload is split out, we've sort of split it out into 3 core phases, and then the grey box is the stuff that we can't currently resolve. But in terms of resolution of cases, we first have onboarding and document preparation, which can take quite a long time. You can see of the 392 cases, 189 cases are still in that phase. Then we prepare instructions for conveyances, and so we would call that a transaction that's instructed on, or a transfer that's in progress. You can see 52 cases in that particular phase of the process, and then 33 cases where we've actually handed over a title deed. I think a big concern for us is the grey block of cases where we haven't actually managed to finalise those, and we've kind of closed them or pended them. And that's typically because we haven't had the documentation that we require, or because there's some other feature that just makes it very difficult for us to move forward on the case. So there might be a dispute, or we might need to trace heirs that we can't find. In terms of the types of cases, our caseload is dominated by title deed problems. So you can see 265, 392 cases are related to title deeds. The house purchase and the house sale much lower, as I mentioned earlier. But of those 265 title deed problems, the split between informal cash sales, deceased estates, and primary transfers is on the right of the chart. And those are the cases that we're going to speak to in this presentation. Just to mention that we have typically cases where there are multiple characteristics. So we might have an informal cash sale where we have a deceased estate in that too, and we have to obviously sequentially go through this, wind up the deceased estate process first before we can move to formalising an informal sale. Our clients are strongly skewed towards female clients, and you can see particularly on the title deed problems, very heavily skewed towards female clients, particularly for deceased estates. You can see over 3/4 of those cases, the client is a woman. But likewise with the other cases, you can see a skew towards women. Only with the sale of properties do we see a skew towards men. And I just want to highlight that we have a blog written by Leslie Downey on this issue that was also funded as part of the work with the Cities Alliance. And we can definitely refer you to that particular blog. In addition to the walk-in cases that we've seen through the TSC, we have worked with the City of Cape Town on a blockchain pilot. So this is a different model. Instead of relying on the individual to walk into the office, bring us their case, and then working with them, in this particular way of working, we've worked with the City of Cape Town. And this is on primary transfers. So Kecia mentions the backlog on primary transfers, which we'll talk to in more detail. But this is a project of 4 particular developments where primary transfer has never taken place. And what we've done there is worked with the city to access information, access administrative information, and then approach those properties, property by property, to try and resolve those primary transfers. And you can see of the 930 properties, we've actually validated data for 656, of which we've signed 257 sale agreements, and we can sign a further 399. Of course, COVID interfered in this work to some degree, and so we're defining some new processes so that we can continue signing sale agreements in that regard. But you can see again a grey block on the side of 274 cases that we can't resolve and that will require further investigation. Okay, so to just have a look at those informal cash sales. Of the 112 informal cash sales that we're trying to regularise, I think the good news is that we actually have managed to move forward with surprisingly high numbers in our estimation. We were surprised that we were actually able to resolve many of those cases. We expected that we would see far fewer being actually resolved. So we would regard the 18 that are in process in terms of transfer and the 10 where we've actually handed over title deeds as as resolved. The 37 are really interesting, where we've got cases that are closed or pended, and that's because there's a dispute or we can't place. Most of the transactions that we formalized are endorsed by SANCO, so they would have been the entity that buyers and sellers would have gone to formalize the transaction in a manner of speaking. And you can see examples of those affidavits that would be signed in the presence of SANCO officials between buyers and sellers. Some of them might be regarded as sale agreements, so if there's enough information in the document, it could be a valid sale agreement. Often the documents aren't dated, often the address isn't specified, often there isn't a price on the document, so sometimes quite difficult to get all of that information subsequent to the transaction. But working with SANCO and street committees, we've kind of encouraged them to refer clients to us and made them aware of the services that we're offering, and specifically that clients can do this at a fairly affordable cost. SANCO typically charges 300 Rand, or street committees will charge 300 Rand for this affidavit. So when clients come to us, if they're paying for disbursements, it might be a little bit more than that, it could be about 1,000 Rand, but then they get their title deed, so it is fairly compelling. And just some pictures of clients where we've actually handed over some title deeds in this category. And as I mentioned, it has been, for those cases that are resolvable, relatively easy for us to resolve them. In terms of number of months that it takes to resolve these cases, you can see our fastest case has taken 3 months to resolve. So as I mentioned, some of them are relatively easy to resolve, but some take a lot longer, say 16 months there. And the reasons for things taking a lot longer then the 3 month on the fastest case would be sort of trouble locating the original seller and getting them to negotiate just to confirm the basis of the transaction. Often sellers live in different provinces, and so Neolisi has often had to contact and find sellers living in the Eastern Cape and drive out and find documents for them to sign, bring them back. Deceased estates is fairly common, as I mentioned. We have combination of cases, so in some cases the seller is actually deceased and we need to find all the heirs and get the heirs to agree that the sale is a valid sale, and then get them to sign all the documents, all the next of kin affidavits and so on, and wind up their deceased estate before we can actually proceed with the formalization of the sale. And then sometimes title deeds are lost, and we'll speak about that a little bit further. But the cost of getting a verified copy of the title deed, just the disbursements would be between 1,200 and 1,500 Rand, and then it takes another 2 weeks for that to be advertised. And then something which is common with many transfers is high arrears on municipal accounts, and clients will have to go to the City of Cape Town and negotiate a payment plan with them to get those arrears reduced. Sometimes they might be eligible for a write-off. Often people have been registered as indigent. And so that whole process of governance that we spoke about earlier, and the importance of governance, really that's something that we see very, very clearly on the municipal accounts. Collectability, or really the collector's effort on the part of the city, is something that really needs to be supported in low income. Just as I mentioned, the VA copy of the title deed, this is a requirement that you actually put an advert in a newspaper that circulates in the area. And again, it's one of those, I suppose the intention of the regulation or the requirement is clear, that we don't want people's title deeds being advertised without their knowledge. But very unlikely that anyone over breakfast is going to be scanning their local newspaper just to check that no one has advertised that they want to get a copy of it. So just a misplaced, if well-intentioned requirement that has an enormous burden for people and delays the process. Just those cases that we've had to pend or close, so we've got 37 of those, and typically we can't trace the sellers through the buyer or community networks or credit bureau. So the seller, we just cannot find the seller. All the facts of the case are disputed. And often what will happen in that case is that it's usually the heirs of the seller who say, no, my parents didn't sell the house, or they'll say, no, the price was too low. So if they sold the house, let's say 10 years ago for 50,000 Rand, people are very aware of the price of housing at the moment in Khayelitsha, so we can't find houses for less than 200,000 Rand very easily. So heirs will see that they have some power and will often use that to dispute the price. And what we're seeing actually is a lot of those cases coming through now, where the informal sale is disputed, and the registered property owner or the heir of the registered property owner might come forward and actually try and evict the current occupant, who is a purchaser, through an informal process. And that obviously is very, very traumatic, and we've seen a couple of those cases, and very difficult because often we're unable to assist that particular client, and all we can say to them is get yourself a really, really good lawyer and go to those court cases and try and defend the sale. There is an opportunity to do more, and that's using the Land Title Adjustment Act, which many before us have spoken about, and certainly the World Bank project has highlighted, and before that consultants and other conveyancers, Leslie Downey in particular, have highlighted this particular act as a critical pathway to resolving some of these very, very sticky cases. And just to, in brief, talk about the LTAA, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but the purpose of the act is to regulate the allocation of certain land in respect of which one or more persons claim ownership but do not have registered title deeds in respect thereof. So it is set up precisely to deal with this kind of matter, and certainly there are examples that we can learn from. What we would like to do going forward is to create some momentum to designate some properties in the area under the LTAA and to appoint a commissioner to adjudicate those properties. Certainly an objective of ours is not only to resolve past informal sales that have taken place, but also to reduce the number of new informal sales that take place going forward. And we try to address that, obviously, by providing an accessible and affordable mechanism to interact with formal processes. But there are regulatory barriers as well. And this is a really interesting advert that was placed on Facebook Marketplace a couple of weeks ago. And you can see in the description of the property, it says this is a cash deal because of the condition of no selling in the first 8 years. And as Kecia mentioned, RDP properties cannot be sold for 8 years. And so people who do want to sell those properties need to get permission from the Western Cape Department of Human Settlements, and that's called a waiver. And you can see an example of a waiver for a property in Blue Downs on the right of the slide. It says application to waive this preemptive right. And it says the department has no objective that the preemptive right included in condition 5 in the title deed in terms of section 10A and 10B of the Housing Act be waived and removed from said title deed. The process of applying for this waiver and getting this waiver can be very cumbersome. So people need to submit a formal application, which is reviewed by an official. And depending on which official you get, it might take anything from a week to 6 weeks for that application. We've had cases now recently where sellers are trying to sell their properties, in particular a case where a property owner has been retrenched because of COVID and is moving back to the Free State because he doesn't see any prospect of getting another job in these conditions. He is a relatively, he's an older person, so he doesn't think he's going to get back into the labour market. And he's making the decision to sell his property. He got a really good price, so it was 280,000 Rand. For a subsidy property, which is the going price in Fuleni. This is where the property was. And for us to get that waiver actually took a lot of effort. And in fact, we were unsuccessful in the TSC. The estate agent who worked on the transfer was way more successful because she knew a more enthusiastic official who would expedite this particular case. We were working with kept coming back telling us it would take 6 weeks. And the seller needed to move back because he didn't have any other income. So I think this is an example of housing being used as an asset in this particular time where people need an asset to fall back on. Of course, the fear of officials is that people sell their houses without due consideration for very little. And I think when we're thinking about this clause, Section 10A and 10B of the Housing Act, and removing this clause, which would be our very strong recommendation, what you'd want to do perhaps is couple that with transaction support, which we think we can offer. So really investigating what are the circumstances under which someone wants to sell their house. Is there an alternative? Could they perhaps get finance if this is a temporary cash flow problem? Could they use the house to generate a form of rental income? These are the options we would look at seriously with the seller. So let's have a look in summary at the recommendations regarding informal cash sales. As I mentioned, remove those sections from the Housing Act. And that would be the stakeholder there would be the National Department of Human Settlements. Things like getting copies of a VA copy of title deeds, and the Land Title Adjustment Act would really fall under the Deeds Office in terms of the title deeds, so the Commissioner of Deeds, and then the department, which would fall under the Department of Agricultural Rural Development. In particular, that's the department that would have to appoint a commissioner under the Land Title Adjustment Act. A lot of work for us to do in terms of encouraging referrals from street committees and SANCO, certainly in terms of increasing the visibility of the TSC to change perceptions about accessibility of formal systems, and then raising awareness regarding the risks of informal cash sales. And then working with the City of Cape Town to establish those formal MOUs, which I mentioned we don't have, so that we can streamline the process of negotiating payment plans and managing high arrears. That would materially impact on those delays that currently take a long time to resolve. Okay, moving on to deceased estates. According to the Deeds Office, so data from the Deeds Office and Home Affairs, I mean, both of them are public record data sets that you can actually analyze, and we asked Noblet Data Science, a company that we've interacted with us in the past, to look at how many property owners as registered in the Deeds Office are actually deceased. And they came back and said to us that in Khayelitsha there are over 7,500 properties that are owned by people who are deceased. It's approximately 16% of all properties in the area. Kecia also mentioned in her introductory comments that many of those properties are worth over 280,000 Rand. We'll talk about that. But in terms of those deceased estate cases, and we're only looking at cases that are deceased estates, no other matters, so not informal cash sales, so pure deceased estate cases. We've got 67 of those cases, and you can see that 19 of those we've had to close or end. But we have handed over 7 title deeds and instructed on another 19. We're still in the document collection phase for 22. And you can see just a case study of a case that we've actually managed to succeed in getting a title deed. Here the client's husband passed away in 2003. It took 7 years for the estate to be reported, and then many, many more years for that case to come to us. So long delays often between the actual events and winding up the estate because it's just not an accessible process. People don't know what to do. And so the TSC really can do a lot of work in helping people navigate those processes. In terms of the length of time, these are very, very time-consuming cases, and they take a long time to resolve. So you can see the fastest matter that we've dealt with has taken 6 months to resolve. The longest one has taken 14 months. And the major reasons for the delays are significant backlogs at the Master's Office. For documents that are required for a transfer, something like the next of kin affidavit, which you have to fill in. It's very difficult to track the process of those matters through the Master's Office. So there's no notification, no notification to come and collect documents, or no information on when they've been posted. So you don't really know where you are in the process. There might be a whole lot of other documents that clients might need to get from Home Affairs, death certificates, marriage certificates, ID documents. Often those don't exist, or sometimes they do exist, but there's a mistake on them. So the process of actually accessing these official documents can be very, very cumbersome. The lost title deeds again comes up, so people might have misplaced them. And then again, the issue with municipal arrears. I just want to highlight what we're seeing with the Master's Office. This is just an example from last year of the office being closed, but through COVID, obviously the office was closed, and now enormous delays and very, very big backlogs at the Master's Office. So a real need to streamline this very, very paper-based process that currently exists, and there are solutions there too. Just want to talk to the issue of the small estates threshold. This is an amount of 250,000 Rand, below which it's a relatively simple process to wind up a deceased estate. If the property is valued at more than 250,000 Rand, it's a very, very cumbersome and very expensive process to wind up a deceased estate. And as I mentioned, referring to a very high proportion of properties in Khayelitsha that are valued at over 250,000 Rand. So when people die, it is a very, very difficult process. And this is just an example of a case that we're still currently dealing with, where the property value was 363,000 Rand. This is an RDP property. property, so it was given to a family precisely because they're poor. The fees to wind up this estate and to transfer the property from the deceased estate to heirs would be over 28,000 rand. Now, this family doesn't have 28,000 rand, as I mentioned. It's a poor family, which is why they were given an RDP house in the first instance. I'm not going to go through all the details. I'll leave it to you if you're interested to read up on this particular case study. But because it's not a small estate, you have to have you go through the regular estate process, including appointing a lawyer, which costs 3.5% of the estate value, and you have to get a letter of authority from the master's office. In this case, took over 80 working days. You have to prepare a liquidation and distribution account and advertise that account for creditors within 30 days. So it's a very, very cumbersome process. And we're at 413 days on this case and counting. So we haven't resolved it yet. And you can just see the number of processes. First of all, trying to find a lawyer to help wind up this estate at low cost. We finally found someone who agreed to discount fees, but even those discounted fees are quite a stretch for the company. In terms of our recommendations, so certainly our first recommendation would be to adjust that small estates threshold. We've already submitted an application with the Free Market Foundation to have this threshold reviewed by the Department of Justice. And we understand from a representative of the Minister's office that it is under review. We don't know how long it will take for the process to wind its way through and actually for us to see this increase in the small estates threshold that was last adjusted in 2015. Obviously, the Master's office, the capacity I've mentioned there is a major problem. There is a paperless estate administration system which exists and really does need to be enhanced and integrated with Home Affairs directly. There is an enormous opportunity for fraud, and particularly if we're saying that that small estate threshold should be increased, we will want to make sure that we limit the risk of fraud. Again, the VA copy of title deeds, very expensive and slows things down. Our work very much to encourage property owners to sign a will. Where people die without a will, it can be fairly complex, particularly where the heirs are minors. That is a particularly complex challenge for us to try and navigate. There's nothing we can do about it. And so there's a lot of work that we need to do to encourage people to do this. And I know there are a lot of skeptics who think that it's just impossible to get poor people to sign a will and they'll never do it. We're optimistic about this. People really understand the difference it makes to winding up a deceased estate when there is a will in place, and then are very happy to do it. Provide information on the deceased estates process, so just let people understand what actually will happen, and then proactively identify deceased estates cases that require resolution. And this is quite tricky. We can identify those cases. How do we approach those clients? To go and knock on people's doors and start asking people about whether they've got their title deeds and whose name is on the title deed. That's a pretty difficult thing for someone to respond to. So we have to be quite strategic in how we do this. Again, encourage people to come forward. That would probably be the process we would follow. And then again, the memorandum of understanding, we would like to be partners to work with a paperless estate administration system, very similar to what we've seen the banks do with the Department of Home Affairs with things like application for passports. If we can be a front end for the Department of Justice and help streamline some of the paper-based processes, that could materially affect some of those delays that we've seen. Okay, primary transfers. So let's just deal with the whole context around primary transfers. Kecia mentioned a title deed backlog in South Africa on those RDP properties. That's estimated to be in excess of 1 million properties that have been built by government but have not been registered. And that backlog seems to us to be increasing as we speak. There was a budget set aside of over 1.6 billion rand. That was over the period 2018-19 to 2020-21 to eradicate the pre-2014 backlog. So that's all the RDP housing that was built before 2014. That grant is available to help municipalities resolve those backlogs. And then the most recent post-COVID budget, that was reduced by 377 million rand, so in the adjusted budget. And that's because it's very difficult for municipalities to actually do this work around the backlog. You can see that those numbers coming through in terms of the number of title deeds to eradicate the backlog, in terms of the 2018-2019 estimate, and this is from government data from the estimates of national expenditure. There were supposed to have been around 250,000 of those title deeds registered. As Kecia mentioned, when they're looking at deeds office data, they're seeing between 20 and 30,000 new registrations coming through. So that's a very unlikely number. And you can see the projections of over 200,000 also very, very unlikely to come through on those pre-2014 title deeds. In terms of post-2014, here's some data on the number of subsidy houses that were completed. That's the number in yellow. So you can see between 77,000 and 99,000, so roughly 100,000 units a year being completed according to government. But in terms of number of title deeds that are registered, those numbers in maroon are significantly lower. So in 2018-2019, for instance, according to the estimates of national expenditure published as part of the budget documents, 77,721 RDP houses were completed, while 37,021 title deeds were handed over on those new projects. As Kecia mentioned, the proxy that CAHF uses tends to find closer to 20,000 title deeds coming through. You can see the estimates for 2019-2020 coming through at over 159,000 title deeds, and then again the 2021 projections of over 229,000 title deeds. Again, for that kind of volume to be going through the deeds office, one would expect to see a very significant increase in allocations to the deeds office. We don't see anything like that. So these numbers we think are very, very unlikely. In the meantime, we have a whole lot of people who are in occupation of subsidy properties. They're living in those houses without any formal tenure at all. We've had a couple of walk-in cases. So about 50 clients have come into the TSC for assistance because they don't have their title deeds. You can see we've managed to resolve very, very few of them, and we've kept most of them in the onboarding case preparation process because that's an engagement with the City of Cape Town. At the moment, the city doesn't have any process to deal with these kind of walk-in cases on a case-by-case basis. So typically, in line with the title registration process, there would be a project for each housing development, which typically comprises a few hundred houses. And so it's very difficult for officials to pull out a particular title deed and work with a particular property. Often the officials are not responsive, so we'll find the project manager who is responsible for a particular project, but we don't get any response. And sometimes the title deed actually does exist and the property has been registered, but we can't find the document. So in those cases, we will try and follow up with city officials who might have title deeds. Here's an example of a successful case study. So we received this title deed in August 2019. And this particular client received the plot in 1992 and signed a sale agreement in 2017. So that's not uncommon, those kind of delays. We see people being sort of having lived on a particular piece of land, but for many, many years before actual tenure is secured. Other cases we've been less successful with, and here's just an example of a case where we've been trying to find a copy of a title deed that does exist. We will follow up with a conveyancer who's listed on the copy of the title deed. That conveyancer told us to go and speak to another conveyancer who was the lead conveyancer on the project. That conveyancer said we should speak to the engineering firm. We spoke to the engineering firm. He said no, they handed over to a city official. We spoke to one official who said no, they gave it to another official. We spoke to that official who said, no, they don't have that title deed. We spoke to a third official, but this is just what it's like to try and find this. And you'll see city official 3 in the last line that says, we don't have the spreadsheet concerning those title deeds. This kind of information is sitting on spreadsheets is just actually unbelievable. And we would recommend that the city ban spreadsheets, because the difficult thing with spreadsheets is that there's no master copy. Everyone has their own spreadsheet. It's very difficult for people to know when things get updated. So a spreadsheet is a particularly bad way of keeping information on these title deeds. I just want to talk to the blockchain register, the blockchain property register that we've been working on as a pilot. And as I mentioned, this was funded by the MasterCard Foundation. This was a different model. So the 50 primary transfer cases that I mentioned earlier were walk-in cases where clients come into the TSC office. In this case, we worked with the City of Cape Town, and we went out to those properties. So we worked fairly closely on 4 project sites in Makaza, Khayelitsha. No transfer had taken place. The properties were built in 2013, 2014. Those pieces of land had been occupied by the current owners for many more years than that. We surveyed 930 properties, and that's conducting an occupancy survey. You literally go door to door, knock on the door, and find out who's living in the property, find out who the occupant believes the owner to be. We validated data for 656, as I've mentioned earlier, and signed 257 sale agreements with 399 awaiting signature. The 274 that we need further investigation, just to give you some, those would typically be cases where people might have died, they might have sold their properties. We'll talk about those in some more detail, but they require a fair degree of hard work, and that's why it's very difficult to spend this money around the title restoration program. It's a very, very cumbersome process to find beneficiaries, to validate sales that might have taken place. In terms of this particular pilot, our office is located in the middle of this area outlined in orange, and the 4 project sites you can see, the 4 blocks of properties: Makaza East with 269 properties, Zone 14 with 299 properties, Makaza Central with 265 properties, and Makaza West with 248 properties. And you can see the number of properties that we've surveyed in each of those. There are 1,079 properties in those 4 sites, and we've completed 930 surveys. The balance, either the property owners didn't want us to survey them. So as I mentioned, it's not an easy thing to get a knock on the door and for people to be asking you questions about the ownership of your property. Some of those have subsequently come back to the TSC and said, no, we'd actually like you to come back and survey our property. In other cases, there was no one home after repeated visits, and so we had to give up on those properties. Why did we choose a blockchain-based solution? Well, really because of the extra security that it gives you in terms of maintenance of that data and securing that. For those of you who are not aware of blockchain technology, we've got a Gartner definition there, which I'm not sure is very helpful, but basically you have an irrevocable record of a transaction which contains a timestamp and a reference to previous transactions. So it's very difficult to tamper with this record. Anyone who has access rights to this register can trace back the original event, and so it lends itself very well to property transactions which are sequential. So you want to see who had the house before and who had the house before that, and you can do that very nicely with blockchain-based technology. The 3 core components: you've got a record of all verified transaction, and it's distributed among the network participants. You can inspect it, and you can't change them without the network agreeing. In our case, we've created a private blockchain. It's not a public blockchain. So in this case, our network participants are specific entities who have those permissions. But the implication is that the data that's in this blockchain register is agreed upon by all participants in that network. Just to give you an example of some of the core foundational points that are used, or building blocks that are used to create this irrevocable record of transactions. The first one is something called hashing. We would probably colloquially say that when you've made a hash of something, you've messed it up. But actually, when we take a hash of a digital document, in this case, it's a photograph of my passport, that is a digital photograph. So it's represented on my computer by a series of zeros and ones. I can take a hash of that, and I'm using a hashing algorithm called SA National, which is a very secure hashing algorithm. And you can do this yourself with any digital document online. You can Google SHA-256, and you'll find a site that will do this for you. Take a digital document and hash it. You can see that the hash I get for my photograph of my passport is B0522EA66, etc., etc. And the interesting thing about taking a hash of a digital document is that if you amend that document even slightly, so in the picture below, I've cut it off slightly on the right side so you can see I don't have that corner on the right hand of the digital document. When I take a hash of that, I get a completely different number. So you can see I'm getting DC7CD, etc. So if I want to know whether a digital document is exactly the same as the original document that I've got on my register, I just need to compare the hashes. Do I get the same hash? I take the digital document that I've got on hand and I compare that with a hash of the digital document that's in the register. So that's a very, very powerful technology that creates a level of security around the underlying documents that are saved. And of course, when we save the document, we don't just save the digital document hash, we include with that a hash of the time and the date and the person who had authorization to conduct that transaction. The other critical building block of the blockchain is that all blocks will contain a hash of the entire previous block, and a block of the blockchain just contains the transactions. So a group of transactions will be grouped together into a block of transactions, and then the next block will contain the hash of the previous transactions on the previous block. So if I tamper with a transaction that took place a few blocks ago, that won't match my current block, because any tiny tampering with a digital transaction will give me a completely different hash, and I need to be able to reproduce the exact hash before I know that it was exactly this transaction or this document that was hashed. So it creates a layer of security that really gives real comfort around the transactions and the record of transactions. We work with a company called Kecia Global, who are very active on the continent. They work in Nigeria, they work in Ghana. And basically what they have built for us is a case management system. The lessons that we've learned out of this blockchain pilot, number one, the most important lesson is around what blockchain technology doesn't do. And I've included a quote from a wonderful document called Blockchain and Property in 2018, which I recommend everyone who's interested in blockchain property to read it. And basically the quote in the block says, blockchain does not resolve the primary challenge of land administration faced in many emerging markets, which is how to bring citizens and properties into the formal system. Blockchain will not help identify who has what right and to where. It will not resolve property rights disputes as properties are brought into the system. Most importantly, it won't resolve the tedious and time-consuming process of collecting, verifying, and bringing data into the system in the first instance. And that's really the process that we've been involved in, is that tedious and very time-consuming process of going door to door and trying to figure out who lives in each property. We're not going to get away from that particular challenge. We have to do that work. And that's not only with primary transfers that haven't taken place, but it's also now with title deeds that are now cloudy because of informal transactions or deceased estates that haven't been wound up. And that's the work of the TSC, the tedious and time-consuming process of collecting and verifying that data. Of course, we want to bring it into a system, and that's critical. As I mentioned, a lot of the cases that we've worked with in the Makaza pilot, there's some cases where people are deceased, where people have sold their properties. We have to verify all of this information. That's 274 cases where more resolution is required. And we're quite lucky that we only have 274 of these cases. In older projects or projects where there's been much higher turnover, there are going to be many, many more of these. And you have to trace each beneficiary and try and find out whether the facts of the matter can be verified. Lesson number two, it's one thing to create the register in the first instance, but you have to have processes to maintain the register over time. So the maintenance of title is as important as creating the register of title. And that's where the whole system, the case management system, is really, really important, because life happens. People buy, people sell, people die, people get married, they get divorced. All of those life events have an impact on property registration. And you have to have accessible processes to enable people to keep their register up to date. And so this is the case management system that CESO has built for us. And I'm just going to show you what the system actually does. This is our sort of front page. You can see the number of owners that we've got, 505 of the 665 are owners, 77 tenants, 100 caretakers. We can see the data for each of the areas, East, West, Central, and Zone 14. And you can also see the service requests at the bottom. We can go to each property and have a look at specific properties. We can view the details of that property. We can see who the owner is of the property. This is verified information, so we verified it. We can see that in this particular case, there's a caretaker living in the property. We can view the details. We can see the documents that we've uploaded with this particular property. So here's the subsidy HSS record from the housing subsidy system to verify this particular person as a beneficiary. And here are the service requests. This is critical because these are the requests that enable people to keep their details up to date. So for instance, if someone dies, we need to know that the property owners died and we need to update those records. And you can see how we can do that. You've got to put in the documents, upload all the details. So those requests, service requests are critical. We can also on the system add a service request and change the documents that we need for a service request. So here I'm just looking at the death service request, and we can see what documents from the list of documents on the right that we need. And I'm going to add, as the super admin user of the system, I'm going to add the death certificate and the ID of the deceased. And what that's going to do is now bring that into the formal process. So unless those documents are uploaded, we cannot move forward with that particular service request. So that's how the case management system works. And I think really the important thing about this is that it's not about technology. So technology is one component of the solution, and the technology is critical and it's an enabler. But you also need people to use the processes that you set up to access this technology. You don't have people voluntarily agreeing to keep their data up to date. We have no way of compelling them to do it. We have no way of compelling them to use the system. And likewise for the formal property system in South Africa, there's nothing compelling people from transacting their properties formally. And critically, we need to enable that with policy. So if you have policies that make it difficult for people to transact formally, they're just not going to do it. And that goes to Section 10A and 10B, but it also goes to the policies that we have around the title restoration process. So in some provinces, that policy might say that people are not allowed to sell their RDP properties, and if they have, the owner needs to be evicted. Well, that's just going to cause absolute havoc in neighborhoods. So again, the policy really has to pay attention to the reality of people's lives. In the Western Cape, the formal policy at the moment is that people need to buy out the subsidy from the province or the city. The subsidy value in this case is over 120,000 Rand. And so in line with that policy, we would have to go back to someone who's purchased a property, let's say recently for 200,000 Rand, and say to them, hey, if you want your title deed, you're going to need to pay another 124,000 Rand. Well, that's just not going to happen. So I think, again, it's really important to position the policy in the context. The third lesson is that there really is value in bringing blockchain-based technology into the day-to-day operations of the TSC and into our case management system. And that's what we're doing with the assistance and funding from Oppenheimer Generations. Is building out the case management system that we've built to cater with primary transfer cases into catering for all the other cases that we've mentioned. Critical that this project has been a project that we've run at scale. And so you can see the difference, the order of magnitude, 930 properties that we've interacted with compared to the 392 cases that we've dealt with on a walk-in basis through the transactions. But of course, if you want to scale, you have to have trust. And starting the TSC small, winning over the trust of people, seeing that there are referrals, being in the area. We've been there for 2 years, doors are open. People know we're not going away. We're a permanent feature of the market. And once you have that, then you can really scale, and then you can do things that can dramatically change the way property markets work in an area. Okay, so to go through these very, very briefly, align policy that's critical with market realities, The City of Cape Town, we think, has got a lot of work to do in terms of the way it manages primary transfers, certainly developing track and trace systems for title deeds so that they don't get lost from the start. Beneficiary management is critical, so the data around beneficiaries, who is in a property, and then processes to keep that up to date. At the moment, that data is a once-off spreadsheet that sits on a project manager's laptop. That just does not work. Integrating beneficiary data into city systems from the start, so don't wait for the title deed. So at the moment, the City of Cape Town will be issuing municipal bills for services on a monthly basis. People who get those bills, there's no name on that bill. It just arrives at the property. And so you can just imagine that people are not terribly inclined to pay for those services. It then means that there's an enormous arrears that builds up. So if we can bring the data on beneficiaries into the city systems straight away, when the property is allocated to a beneficiary, that is now integrated into the city systems, which means that that beneficiary can also apply to add on a room formally, and certainly can apply for indigency status so that they can start to be billed appropriately. Occupancy survey data is collected often in paper, again, often on spreadsheets. There's no way to keep that up to date. There's no way to verify it formally. It's really a total nightmare. The whole process really can be reviewed and streamlined, and then enable beneficiaries to keep their own data up to date, including when they sell their property. The Transaction Support Centre really needs to reach out to beneficiaries to say to them, come in, keep your data up to date, develop mechanisms to share information with the city so that it can be integrated, and again, focus on increasing awareness of informal cash sales, particularly when those sales are for in excess of 200,000 Rand, which is what we're seeing. Okay, so to end off a way forward for the TSC, we've put together 4 work streams for our growth strategy. The first is to change the fundamentals, so that's critical, to work on processes that really change the system. The second is to optimize the current model, and to, which would then allow us to scale up locally, and then that would then take us to our 4th work stream of replicating nationally. So I'm going to talk to each one of those very briefly and then hand over back to Kecia. On the fundamentals, really the whole property law issue is critical, obviously, and we need to pay more attention to this. We're starting to see some rulings coming through on property transfers that have been informal. We're seeing some fairly scary rulings coming through on 10A and 10B, which basically nullify those sales that have taken place because they're in violation of Section 10A and 10B, and basically transferring those properties back to the province. Again, this creates enormous instability in property markets. So when you're saying to someone who's paid 150,000 or 200,000 Rand for a property, and you're saying to them, sorry, you never bought this property, you can now go after the seller if you want to get your money back, but actually this property belongs to the province, that just creates enormous instability. So it really is about monitoring these cases, preparing and leading test cases so that we can start to establish a body of case law that is more favorable to market development. Likewise with technology, so I'm going to just skip over to developing the Property and Technology Advisory Panel. A lot of really interesting things happening in the space of technology, which could fundamentally shift the way property transfers happen and make it way more efficient and accessible for people to transact in property. Looking at property in the economy, really critical to look at that and make sure that we can bring that understanding into the policy space, which is the 4th component there, really engaging on an active basis with national and provincial around policy. Optimizing the way that we work in the TSC, the case management system, I've mentioned, critical for us to have an irrefutable record of those cases that come through. Signing formal MOUs with the province and with the City of Cape Town is really important to the way that we work. And then those resolution mechanisms on disputed transactions or transactions that we can't currently resolve. So that would be the Land Title Adjustment Act, which I spoke to, as well as the distribution and transfer of certain State Land Act, which is applicable where there's been no primary transfer. Scaling up, once we've got those processes in place, it's possible for us to scale up either through proactive project-driven interventions, which might mean door-to-door enumerations of the area if we have trust, and certainly piloting new front-end formats with local partners such as banks. There's no reason for people to have to come to the TSC office to access the system that we've built. If we build it correctly and we have centralized case management, clients might be able to access that system through various front-end formats, including banks and retailers. And then replicating nationally would require us to identify sites outside the City of Cape Town, to establish MOUs with those municipalities and provinces, and also with the National Housing Finance Corporation, establishing MOUs with the Department of Justice and Home Affairs. I've mentioned that. So if we're at the point where we can replicate, it becomes easier for us to have those negotiations, and then rolling our partners for front ends right across the country. So that's really our strategy in terms of our growth strategy. In closing, just to reiterate a couple of key points, the housing program really has created real assets. It's not just about palliative care for people who are poor and will forever be poor. That's not what the program actually has done. It's created assets, but weak administration really limits the potential value of these assets and undermines sustainability of cities. So really important to focus on administration. Some of the systems that underpin administrative systems at the moment are very big and very slow moving, and it's very unlikely that we'll be able to change those systems speedily. But the important thing that I think we've demonstrated is that we can build supporting systems around those big administrative systems that can enable more efficiencies. So if the housing subsidy system cannot be changed quickly, we can build our own beneficiary administration systems around that, so that we can monitor who lives in the property, and when all the mechanisms that currently prevent transfer are resolved, we can then proceed with transfer once that's in place. Likewise, the systems that are required to formally transfer properties in the deeds office, there's a lot that we can do to make sure that if we can't get there at the moment for whatever reason, we've built up the body of evidence to enable back-to-back transfer as soon as a missing link in the chain is resolved. Of course, in terms of sustainability, our model at the moment doesn't charge the households we serve, but just because we haven't for the purposes of this pilot, it doesn't mean we shouldn't once we're able to scale up. We haven't charged households because we can't promise a level of service. We can't say to someone, we can resolve your case, we can negotiate a payment plan with you in the City of Cape Town, or we can work with the Master's Office to resolve this deceased estate. We don't know how long things are going to take. We can't make any promises to clients, and so we've been reluctant to say to clients it's going to cost you 2,000 or 5,000 rand for a property transfer. But certainly going forward, once we've professionalized our systems, once we've got MOUs, once we've got formalized case management systems, we think there's real capacity to charge. So just before we hand over back to Kecia, just to say thank you to the team who works with the TSC on this project. So in particular, to thank Jess for putting this presentation together, to thank Lisa, to thank Masi, to thank Nyolisi, and our thoughts are with Zonke's family. Zonke was a member of the team and unfortunately passed away recently. And just to say that it's been a real privilege to work on this project, and to thank Kecia for the partnership, to thank all the funders, and to thank the audience for your time. And we're looking forward to a next update and reporting back on more progress in the future. So I'll hand over to Kecia.
Thank you so much, Illana. That was great. And I think what I keep on thinking about as I see this and hear the story of the TSC, what strikes me so clearly is just how possible the solutions are, and that you've outlined in quite a lot of detail all of the things that different households are having to face as they try to maximize the value of their property and really just live within their communities and make their property work for them. And there are real solutions to this. So what we wanted was for this to be a real good news story, for the city to feel that there's so much that can be done to improve upon the current systems that exist, and that those are indeed possible. the reasons for doing that are quite significant, as Illana outlined. By stimulating and supporting our residential property market at the bottom end, we really will make a significant contribution to our national challenges of economic growth, of job creation, and of building the cities so that they are functional, sustainable human settlements in which people can operate. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating, and very happy for some questions. Bye. So I've gone through, I'm going to try and summarize some of these questions. And Illana, are you ready? There was a couple of them around the blockchain, and one person was asking if the blockchain is a parallel system, and how do you manage it as a parallel system? That same person wanted to know about data privacy issues.
Yeah, we wouldn't see it as a parallel system. We would see it as a sort of a partner system. So you want to end up in the deeds registry, but how do you keep a record of the process of getting there? So it might take a while. So for instance, we haven't worked with this, but our colleagues on the World Bank project have looked mainly at impediments to transfer that arise from sort of the planning side. So there's no general plan in place. So we might know who the beneficiary is, and we might have done our occupancy survey, but it's going to take many, many months before that property is registered, is able to transfer in the deeds registry, because there are problems with the general plan. What we're suggesting is that once you have a beneficiary in a house, what you need to do is just manage that beneficiary so that when all other impediments to transfer have been resolved, you're ready to go. So if someone has died, or if someone has sold the property, you have a record of all those transactions back to back, verified, immutable. We can't change them. We signed this document with this person on this date in front of witnesses. Here it is. So when we come to do the transfer, we don't have to run around the country trying to find the heirs of a deceased beneficiary who sold the property 5 years previously. So I think that's how we would see it, and that's what I mean when I say we need to build systems and processes around the existing administrative system. So the housing subsidy system, we're not going to change that system quickly. But when a project manager puts a beneficiary into a subsidy house, there's no reason the project manager has to record that information on a spreadsheet. If you recorded that information on a better system that you could then use to keep up to date on an ongoing basis, we would then be able to transfer properties way better, way quicker, and also we'd be able to share that information with the city. Well, the city internally could access that information. So the property value chain could access information on who the occupant is immediately and send a bill with that person's name on immediately, even though there hasn't been a title deed registered yet, for a host of reasons. So I think that's how we would view it. On the privacy issue, the way we dealt with it on this project is that we asked people for their consent. So we had a long sort of list of disclosures around how the information would be used and where the information would be saved, and what kind of rights people had to remove the information from the system, and who would have access rights to get the information. And it was very explicit that the information would be shared with the city. So we try to do that. I think we need to learn a lot more about protecting privacy, and I think that's also critical in our processes going forward. It's a vital feature, and I think we're very aware of the principles behind the Protection of Personal Information Act. We're very aware of those principles. We want to embed them so that we're really not just keeping up, but really setting a standard for how to manage privacy.
Thanks, Illana. There were a bunch of questions around RDP house price trends, and can you see cause and effect where neighborhood, where access to jobs, where access to other amenities are changing the kind of prices in the market? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely worthy of a study. I mean, I can just comment anecdotally on what we're seeing and where the areas are where there is very, very high demand for property. So areas like Mfuleni, those properties are selling very quickly, cash sales, 250 and 280,000 rand a property. Those are all very, very beautifully built subsidy properties. They're relatively new. They're often problems with getting title deeds for those properties. So sometimes they have been registered and the title deeds are sitting somewhere we don't know where. In other cases, they haven't actually been transferred. There's a bit of a problem in that area in particular, but we're seeing a lot of interest and a lot of movement in Fuleni. Obviously, we're in Khayelitsha, we see a lot of movement, a lot of growth there too. We're watching very closely to see what the impact of COVID is going to be. I mean, there's been a lot of interest in backyard development. It's visible when you drive through the streets. You can see multi-story buildings, 2-story and 3-story walk-ups that landlords have developed. So those are all the anecdotal bits of evidence. On the other hand, areas that are not doing so well, an area like Delft-Leiden, for instance, people seem to be moving out of that area and it seems to be crime-related. But I think it's definitely worthy of a good study. I think there's wonderful visible data that can be used to assess some of these drivers of property market trends, because we do see different parts of the city behaving differently.
Illana, there was a question from Lauren about the transactions, the backlog in primary transactions, and whether that's a systemic constraint, that is how that's undermining the functioning of residential property markets. And then she also wanted to look at, she says here, require a more in-depth look into systemic failures rather than or in addition to just simply rectification of a title deeds backlog.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the second question, but maybe Lauren can clarify. But on the first one, I think the way we're starting to understand what's happening in the neighborhood, I mean, and it's a very interesting neighborhood, and we didn't talk to some categories of problems. There are about 1,200 properties in the immediate vicinity of the TSC, which have been transferred to people who have never lived in them, don't even know they own the property. We didn't even get onto that category. It's just a little bit of a complicated category, and we don't really have a clear way forward for those properties. I think Stefan was talking to some of those suggestions that he's put forward around those. But what it does set up in a neighborhood when there's so much uncertainty around tenure and so much insecurity, is that it's really, it kind of feels like a tinderbox, you know, things, you know, the tension between neighbors, the kind of interaction with the city, you know, so what is the role of a street committee or an area committee? It seems to be their primary role is to interact with the official who is in charge of the titling process. So you have power in your community if you've got that official's phone number. So instead of every citizen having the ability to engage with the city, only some citizens have the ability to engage with the city. So it really does, for us, just set up a whole really unhealthy way of interaction with the city. The whole idea of improved governance becomes very, very difficult. We've seen that. I didn't highlight it on the one slide, but the subsidy cases that came through the door, so people coming in to apply for subsidies, that was principally consolidation subsidies. So there are a lot of properties in the areas that are still shacks, so they service sites. So there's a toilet stand and a pipe, a toilet and a sort of piped water on the site, but there is no house, and so there's a lot of sort of positioning on the part of developers to kind of get contracts to build top structures, but for that people need their title deed. So it becomes quite a contest. I don't know how to describe it, but quite a contested space because of this. And I do think that we haven't paid enough attention to that kind of dynamic. But then again, the solution around administrative visibility doesn't necessarily mean that we have to wait for the title deed. If we can create administrative visibility, if we can create some mechanism to enable the city to engage with property owning citizens as quickly as possible, even if they don't have a title deed, we think it can go a long way. I mean, the second question, maybe if we can get a little bit more on that question.
Okay. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to just add a little bit more clarity into the chat. And in the meantime, Illana, there was a really nice suggestion, I think, well, lots of questions asking what happens to the sellers? Where do they move to? And I think that there's a really interesting opportunity for us to explore that further and maybe talk about access to deeds records.
Yeah. So where the seller buys a subsequent property, that transaction, and that's a formal purchase, that transaction would be visible in the deeds registry. So that's a wonderful opportunity, is to do a study on a cohort of people who sell, how many of them subsequently purchase. That would be very interesting. What we've seen with the transactions that we facilitated, and Jess and Lisa, who are on the call, might want to just jump in here, but in many cases, people are selling and moving back to the Eastern Cape and investing in housing. So I've got a couple of pictures that I get every now and then by WhatsApp from a few clients on their homesteads that they're building. That's a fairly common pathway. I think we would like to keep track of this, and I think it's an interesting question around providing advice to sellers, and what kind of, you know, if you're selling someone an insurance policy, you have to get, you know, accredited to sell that. You know, if you're selling someone a house, you're presumably an estate agent. Are you also accredited to provide advice on whether it's a good idea to be selling this house, or whether you want to perhaps borrow money against it, or whether you want to perhaps put a tenant in the house and rent it out for a while? So the whole housing advice component, and then monitoring what actually happens to people, I think is something interesting for us to start thinking about. I mean, you know, you tread warily when it's providing advice, because you really don't know people's circumstances. But I think just even providing people with access to information around what is a wise investment, what could you do, you know, if you need cash, you know, sell your house in a rush. That is an option. It's not a great option. What else could you do? You know, so I think that's quite interesting for us to think about.
Questions just come through from Adrian Harris about the cost of all of this. It's a question that came up earlier as well. I think it was also in one of the questions that we got in advance from people when they were registering. And how do we mediate that within the context of an estate agency sector, and the kinds of services that you need in different segments of the market? Yes.
Well, I can tell you what our costs are. We think it costs us about between 2.5 and 3,000 rand to deal with each matter. And you can see a lot of matters never resolve. So it's the ones that have resolved. Those ones we think between 2.5 and 3,000, and that's just looking at the number of hours that we're spending on cases. There are the outliers that drag on and on and on and require multiple emails and multiple calls and multiple meetings. I mean, I can think of some of them that would have been far more expensive than that. In terms of the way the office is set up, and the way we've worked with Lisa, our conveyancer, it's certainly possible for us to upskill our administrative assistant to become a paralegal, so that she can actually do some of the drafting. We think we can also integrate better with conveyancers, integrate better with the city, perhaps take even more of the work that the conveyancers are currently doing into the space of the TSC. So for instance, getting the rates clearance certificate, if we brought that into the work of the TSC, we would know immediately whether there's an arrears problem. If we could integrate with the city and their revenue department around creating payment plans for clients, that would strip out a lot of time, a lot of cost, and allow us to proceed more rapidly. So there's definitely stuff we can do on our side to bring the costs down, we think, of those sort of plain vanilla cases, the cases that move through nicely. In terms of what it's actually costing a conveyancer, it's hard for us to know. We try and deliver them as clean a case as possible, but there is still toing and froing and up and down, and we need this document and that document. They do need to pay attention to the documents that come through, and I think this is part of our conversation with conveyancers around what are they comfortable with. They're taking personal responsibility for the transaction. They need to make sure that those documents that we give them are authentic, they're verified, they're correct. So the last thing they want is to rely on us to do something and we'll end up doing a bad job. So I think it's a very important area to look at. But the more we can streamline, the more we can integrate and create sort of fail-safe processes that are automated, I think the more we can strip costs out. That said, those difficult to resolve cases are going to be there, and that's going to shift things quite a lot. So how we create some kind of underwriting mechanism to manage those, and who sits with that risk. At the moment, we've been fortunate in that we've had donors, and at the same time, we've had very willing partners in the private sector who've worked with us. You know, again, the World Bank project, I mean, they had great ideas around BEE and conveyances. I think those need to be explored. I think they're real options with the current system as it's currently configured to bring costs down. And then that's not to mention where the future can go in terms of streamlining and digitizing processes more, sort of more, you know, much more.
We're coming to, I'm going to give you one more, maybe two questions, but the point that Lauren was making is that with the title deeds restoration program, that's a retrospective program, the 1.1 million properties that need their title deeds, but that backlog, as you pointed out, is growing every year. So there seems to be a systemic issue in the way in which we are actually affecting transfers to begin with. And does that need itself to be fixed?
You know, absolutely. I mean, it's just incredible. The question is, will it happen speedily in our days? And maybe I'm not very optimistic these days, but I don't think so. You know, to get this whole process of the way we build subsidy housing and the way we administer the subsidies, that is a big ship to turn. So I think best we get on with a solution that assumes that that very big and ugly ship is going to be on the seas for a while. And let's, you know, cities can implement better beneficiary management processes. I mean, you can, you know, transaction support centers can be created all around the country. I mean, it's not, you know, that has to be the vision. And the ship will turn when the ship turns. And hopefully we can put a little bit of pressure to get that ship moving a little bit faster. But I don't think we can wait for it. Every house that we build and every occupant or beneficiary that moves into a property without a title deed, in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, that is a total nightmare to try and fix that. So let's rather administer differently. Let's rather manage that beneficiary. Let's allow that beneficiary to keep their details up to date. Let's create an accessible mechanism for them to use. So I would say that that would be the answer. The system, maybe I've just lost hope, but I don't think we're going to change the system in a hurry.
I don't think you've lost hope. But here's the last question is, in fact, what you're talking about is the way in which the TSC relates to municipalities and the way in which residents are able to access the administrative support that they need that comes from municipalities. And maybe if you can just close on that, in the way in which we build the capacity of municipalities to engage with active property market transactions that are happening every day without them or with them.
You know, it just triggered a memory for me. I was sitting in Charles Rudman's office many years ago when we started to think about this. It's probably about 3 or 4 years ago. And we described this transaction support center that would help people get title deeds so that they could get FLISPs and whatever. But it was really around the FLISP, you know, the subsidy and helping people buy and sell. And he looked at us and he said, I will not have the city involved with a glorified estate agency. And he basically sort of like went on about the importance of enabling governance. Good governance. Good governance, you need to know who the citizen is. You need to know who the property owner is. We've had cases where people are coming to us to say they've been given a demolition order by the inspector because they've put up something that's in violation of, you know, without planning permission, so they have to take it down. They want to apply for permission, but the property is registered in the name of a deceased relative, and the official will not take a building plan request from someone who doesn't have a title. So it's a complete catch-22. So I think the sooner we can get administrative records that bring visibility, and it's, you know, it's the same discussion we're having about informal settlements in South Africa. Just create administrative visibility. How that links to your rights, and I think maybe that's where the city gets really scared. So are we sure this is the right beneficiary? We don't want to give them any guarantees, any certificates, anything to, you know, just in case that they don't qualify to be a beneficiary, and then we've shot ourselves in the foot. I don't know what the fear is, but waiting until we get a title deed is just delaying the process unnecessarily. If we work with the city to say, we've gone through these processes of verifying the records. Here's, here is our system. You can audit it. You can see we uploaded this digital document on this date. It cannot be changed. We've put it on this blockchain. For it to change, we have to have a whole lot of entities colluding, including the city, because we'd love the city to be part of the solution. I think we can really move somewhere with this. And it would be wonderful to hear from city officials in further engagements around MOUs, how we do that, how we share information with them, give information back to them so that they can include this in their formal systems without having to have the title deed. That's going to be an interesting one.
Great. So there's definitely a future going forward. Hey, thanks very much. And thank you to everybody for your questions. I would just like to invite Bridget Fury to just say a few words. We've just been awarded a grant from Oppenheimer Generations Foundation, and we're very grateful for this. It sets up quite an exciting future. And it would be great, Bridget, if you could say a few words. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Just firstly to say thank you so much to all the presenters today. I mean, even though we've been kind of on a journey with Kecia and Illana the last almost year trying to understand the work of the TSC, I think just the mere fact that we've had 160 people on this call demonstrates the interest and the importance of the work that is being done. And yeah, just to say we're delighted. I mean, Oppenheimer Generations Foundation is the philanthropic arm of Oppenheimer Generations, which is Nikki and Jonathan Oppenheimer's entity to look after its interests. And I'm very privileged to head that up. And just to give you some context as to why we think this work is important and why we think we should be funding it. We really believe that the only way in which we're going to kind of move forward in areas of huge difficulty, and I think we see this as an area that's kind of seen as intractable and very difficult, is to be able to experiment and test things and to fund some of that. And so we're kind of coming at the end of the 2-year process at TSC where they've already done an enormous amount of work, but we're hopeful that we can build on the lessons that have learned and that we can fund more experimentation, as Illana has described it, that allows the learning to be shared and workarounds to be found to unlock some of the opportunity that exists, that is kind of latent and not available currently. So we're very excited to embark on, I think it's a year-long grant to help with all 4 phases of the next stage of TSC, both in terms of kind of replicating elsewhere in the country, to scaling, including to scaling at a kind of lower cost with regards to possibly a TSC in a box, or being able to use the front end of municipalities or banks to deliver this. But I think the thing that is very important for us as funders is that this is not just a standalone project, but that it talks to issues, systemic issues that cut across the country, that cut across a whole bunch of different problem areas. And I think the key piece around building relationships with government at various levels, with civil society organizations, and pulling that together in a comprehensive way, in much like this particular workshop is done, is really important, because we don't want there just to be a beacon of hope for 300 households in Makaza, but really for this to start a process which hopefully will be able to scale. So thank you for all your hard work, and we're really looking forward to working alongside the team and other partners going forward.
Thank you so much, Bridget. We are too. We're very excited about the possibilities and the plans, and we're super excited about everybody's participation in that, whether through this call, but in also our other engagements. We look forward to lots more engagement with all of you, and we hope to be communicating on the way forward. Thank you. Okay. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.